and welcome everyone to our Spectrum X Radio Shop chat. I'm Nick Lanneman. I'm Center Director for Spectrum X, and I'll just have a few words to sort of summarize this series of presentations in our center, and then I'll introduce today's speaker. So if you could go to the next slide, Emily. If you aren't already aware, Spectrum X is a fairly large national level center in the US. We refer to it as the world's largest academic hub for cultivating research, innovation, education and workforce development, and translation into policy in the radio spectrum ecosystem. We've got a number of partners across various universities throughout the US, a number of industry partners, a number of government collaborators as well. And all of this is really structured through a pretty intentional memorandum of agreement between the NTIA, the FCC, and our funding sponsor, the NSF, which we've been really grateful to have that additional structure and those partnerships with the regulators in the US. If you could go to the next slide, Emily. So we really set out to be, as I said, an academic hub to try to create a mechanism for academics to get more involved in spectrum issues. To engage across the radio spectrum ecosystem, not duplicating efforts being done elsewhere, but to tie into them and interact with those efforts across the entire ecosystem, and to create more mechanisms and more support for academics, both students and faculty, to do that kind of work. And so that's our major goal as a center, which we've been doing now for a little over 5 years. Next slide. So of many programs that we run, the Radio Shop Chats is a series of seminars conducted over Zoom. The intent here is this is not just for the center, it's the entire research community and policymakers as well. Everyone from industry, government, academia are invited to engage in these seminars. The intent is to educate, perhaps debate, and really spark more collaborations across the ecosystem. So typically we have a presentation. I'll be introducing our speaker here today in a minute. It's a constructive dialogue. In today's case, we'll have questions at the end of the presentation. We do deliver this by Zoom and we record the session. And with permission of the speaker, we post the video and the slides from the presentation. Until we get that all sorted and published, we do operate these sessions under the modified Chatham House rules. So what you learn here today, what you hear here, you can use the information, but don't cite, the sources of that information or the participants in the conversation until that becomes more publicly posted on our website. You could go ahead to the next slide. In terms of getting more involved, if you're not already involved in the center, we welcome that. You can check our website. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And there are ways to, express interest in collaborating with the center. This link at the far left here of getting involved, if that's of interest to you. We welcome that. Okay, next slide. So with that, it's really a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dennis Roberson. As you probably know, Dennis has a very distinguished career in this field. I got to know Dennis when he was CTO of Motorola and had transitioned into a role as essentially Vice President for Research at Illinois Institute of Technology. And he was doing a lot of interesting work with spectrum monitoring and the so-called Spectrum Observatory there. And since that time, he's really been driving a lot of interesting R&D and reports at the national level through his company called Roberson and Associates, for which he's CEO. One of those projects is he's been doing some work with his team on the National Radio Quiet Zone. And so he very graciously offered to give this Radio Shop chat here today. I'll add one other comment, which is that Dennis has been an absolutely tremendous chair of the advisory board for Spectrum X, and a really valued mentor to me and others in the leadership team, helping us structure the center and move it forward. So not only do we thank Dennis for his intellect and his willingness to give this seminar here today, but we also thank him for his wisdom and his leadership. With that, Dennis, I'll hand things off to you, and I look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That's an expansive introduction, so I appreciate that. And I will do a quick check since this so often is the most difficult part, getting the slides on the screen and everyone able to see them. And is that the case? Seeing a head nod from Nick, so
Yep,
we're
I see
off
them.
and running. Good. Usually you flip over the introduction slide very quickly, but I'm going to pause for a moment because the picture has significance for the talk itself. Many of you are familiar with the National Radio Quiet Zone. Some of you are not. We'll talk a little more about what that quiet zone is, but this is a picture of the Green Bank Observatory area, and what you'll see is there are a number of radio telescopes in the background. I'll have an expanded version of the Green Bank telescope that's sitting sort of in the upper middle of this. But what I'd like you to note is that this is rolling hills with lots of trees, and that becomes important to the study that we undertook, as you will see as we move forward. But again, I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I think this will be a helpful talk because it blends together the spectrum needs across a pretty wide set of areas, including the use of radio telescopes to understand what goes on in the rest of the universe. So this is the Green Bank telescope, 35 stories tall, large enough that you can play American football on the surface of the dish. So it's an enormous beast. And that is what the radio quiet zone protects. Topically, we're going to hit a number of areas that really reflect the study that we undertook, trying to first understand the environment itself and then establish potential actions that we could take to enhance the environment, and then what that ultimately came down to in terms of recommendations. If we have time, we may get into the status and where that goes from here. So, the background. The National Radio Quiet Zone itself is 13,000 square miles, a very large area that sits in the eastern part of West Virginia, western part of Virginia. The major facility is the Green Bank Observatory. There's an additional facility that is important as well, public or government facility here. The goal that we were given, the task we were given, is to look at the needs not just of the facilities and preserving those facilities, though that was critical, but as you will see on this, there are a lot of dots which represent communities within the National Radio Quiet Zone, and there are a fair number of people who live there, and they do have the needs and a growing expectation that they would enjoy the same communications capabilities that we all enjoy on a daily basis, including, as needed, the emergency services capabilities and the communications that are so much a part of how those operate so well. Our goal was to look at this for the long term, starting at 5 years and extending out to 30 years. What were the things that could be undertaken that would enhance the lot of the people in the National Radio Zone? The observations, and next slide will give you the conclusions up front. The National Radio Quiet Zone is a very unique area, but in many respects, it's not more disadvantaged, which was one of the conjectures up front, that it was particularly disadvantaged because it didn't have the telecommunications infrastructure that other areas have, but because of pure economic and geographic regions. It's not much different than a lot of other parts of the U.S. So this was a fundamental early finding. The regulations that exist that preclude a lot of use of wireless communications are stringent and were viewed as very stringent when they were put in place 75 years ago, but are in a growing way insufficient to fully protect the facilities that are there as they try to reach out further into the universe and to understand more. The immediate priority is emergency services, and this was, having visited the area a couple of times, hear lots of war stories of how difficult it is to contact the emergency services you need and then for them to conduct their business, and we'll talk a fair bit about that. Mobile broadband is an imperative. It's really a requirement that we all expect day by day, and we'll cover that a little bit more as we go. But that was a clear observation. One that was not so obvious and really stems from a book that William and Webb and I wrote about a year ago, The End of Telecom History. We discovered that there is a change in what is going on out there in telecommunications. Every year, we look to have higher performance, more capacity, and that is beginning to come to an end, and we'll show that in a greater way as we go along. So the fundamental courses of action up front, mobile broadband is really the most important element to be focused on. Fixed broadband is largely being satisfied, so there's less focus needed there. But emergency services, often depending on mobile broadband, are critical as well. So with that, the first item is the first item, and that is the fundamental focus of what you will see as we move forward. So the current assessment, most of you are aware that FCC has upgraded their definition of what broadband is. It used to be 25 megabits per second and 3 megabits per second up. It's now 100 megabits per second with 20 megabits per second for the uplink. And that is about what we use. In fact, many of us use more than that. For mobile services, 35 up, 35 down, 3 up. And then for anchor institutions, that there would be 1 gigabit per second for each 1,000 students and staff or individuals using it. So that's the state of play now. What we all know, the cell phone world is now pervasive. Everyone, to a first order in the United States, from an engineering round-off standpoint, everyone has a cell phone. And it's particularly for the 18 to 49 age bracket, the largely working population. Everybody uses their cell phone all the time. As you get older, people use it less, and particularly smartphones versus old ancient cell phones. And then above 65, in my age bracket, the usage declines, although not for me personally. There's no correlation in income. It's absolutely pervasive. No demographic alternatives to the age ones that are shown here. So again, a statement that you all know, mobile broadband internet is fundamental. It's how we accomplish the things of our life on a day-by-day basis, unless you are in the National Radio Quiet Zone, in which case this is not available to you. The new news that I suggested in the opening slides, we all know that we have a new generation of cellular technology every 10 years or so. But the new news is that the growth in mobile broadband is actually declining now. The growth, not the absolute use. The absolute use is still slightly growing, but the rate of growth is declining and is heading towards an asymptote of no growth at all. And we see that in projections. We also see it looking back in history, this very busy chart in the upper right. shows the different parts of the world. We're all converging in the same way. So that's new news, and it has a positive impact on what the solution might be for the National Radio Quiet Zone as we move forward. Public safety, I'll hit that one relatively hard because it's so critical. We absolutely depend on wireless communications being there in order for people in the public safety world to be able to handle our needs, be it police, fire, or ambulance services. Emergency service workers depend on wireless communications for an ever-growing set of their needs, and that's illustrated in the lower part here. And they use them not just with smartphones, but tablets and other devices. The interesting feature is beyond this growing set of applications is that we're moving beyond just the use of them in the context of smart devices. We're seeing them also with UAVs, the uncrewed autonomous vehicles, drones for the common view. This is a growing part of the emergency services, and it's dependent on the ability to communicate to those UAVs with some wireless device. So another factor that has to be built into the system. If you look at emergency response, these are the elements if you're really focused in this area. And Paul Steinberg, the former CTO of Motorola Solutions, created or at least introduced this chart to the work that we did. And these are the various steps in the process of getting the services that are needed to the person who needs the services. The difficult part is the two blue bubbles at the front end of this line. And that is actually calling in the emergency. But in the National Radio Quiet Zone, since there is no cell phone capabilities, we actually, the most compelling story I heard, a car ran off the road and disappeared because the rolling hills, back to that first picture that I called your attention to, it is very easy to disappear if you happen to go off the roadway there. Fortunately, there was a mother and son. The son was able to get out of the car. The mother was not. The son walked about a mile to a home, was able to knock on the door. The people had a landline phone. He called the ambulance service and then tried to describe, since there's no GPS, tried to describe exactly where the accident had taken place. Ultimately, that took about a half an hour to get the ambulance on its way. And then the ambulance could not check in along the way, but had to go somewhat blind based on the directions that had been given by the son. Did pick up the mother who needed emergency care and then drove the half an hour to the hospital. So what is normally in an urban or suburban environment, a 15-minute kind of activity for this sort of off-the-road circumstance, took closer to an hour and a half. And this is one of the big challenges that we're dealing with and trying to remedy with the study that we undertook. Population trends, one of the things that we heard was that, again, that because of the National Radio Quiet Zone, the population was declining. As it turns out, we discovered that it was declining, but not because of that. We found similar declines in other regions immediately outside the National Radio Quiet Zone, and some even worse than there, based on the economic circumstances, particularly in West Virginia. And the lower slide here, I think many of you are aware of this, but the population of the United States has grown considerably over the last 100 years. The thing that people don't always recognize is that all of that growth has occurred in urban and suburban environments. And in rural environments, the red line at the bottom has basically been flat for the last 100 years or so. So it is not surprising that if not decline, which it has declined in the relevant counties, that there would be, at best case, no growth in a rural environment. There are emerging technologies that need to be thought about, and we see all sorts of information about what's going on in space these days. And I'm sorry for doing the advertisements here, but just wrote a book on that subject that's just been released a couple of months ago. But space is really enabling a lot of the solution to the problems I've been describing, but it's also creating problems because the communications that satellites project to the Earth also will impact the radio telescopes that are in facilities like the Green Bank Observatory area. So how to balance the opportunity with the potential impact is a key element, and one that is being managed by National Science Foundation and the NRAO organization that is funded by the National Science Foundation. So this is a factor to be understood and dealt with as we move through. One of the challenges, again, back to that first picture, is the terrain and the foliage in the National Radio Quiet Zone, which does have a negative impact on the ability to utilize Starlink to solve some of the problems in the area. So the needs assessment, one of the key needs is to protect the facilities. And what we show here are the radio astronomy spectral areas that have been set aside because of the relevance to observing the universe in specific areas. And to the left are the very stringent requirements that are out there for protecting those special pieces of spectrum that allow us to see the universe. And they do cross a very broad range, which is one of the challenges, from 100 megahertz to 116 gigahertz, up in the near terahertz range. So understanding what has to be protected is very, very important and relevant to this whole operation. Coexistence is key, and understanding what impacts what is very, very important. Again, turning back to that initial picture, there are hills that surround the Green Bank Observatory and also the other government facility that shield it from radio waves coming from long distances. It turns out that if you look at the chart on the left, the illustration on the left, the Green Bank Observatory is the left blue dot, and the Sugar Grove Research Center or Research Station is on the right. From a radio telescope standpoint, the protection that is really needed is in the brown area in the middle, and a lesser protection for the Sugar Grove Research Station. The yellow gives the zone of protection for cellular insertions into this area. And you can see this again, not very well, I would imagine, but those same illustrations are here, and the amount of wireless activity is here, and you'll see this a lot more when we move through. The interesting opportunities, especially for the Green Bank Observatory, they don't observe the same spectrum all of the time. And in fact, mostly they observe at night when there's less ambient noise. So there is the potential to share the information and to use the spectrum when it's not being used for observations. And that works very well for the Green Bank telescope, the giant telescope, which needs to be protected since it has liquid-cooled receivers that if you beam a radio wave to them, they're likely to destroy the receivers. The challenge is that there are other experiments like the CHIME experiment that use spectrum in the 600 to 800 megahertz range 24/7 because they're trying to find very unique emissions that occur at totally unexpected times. And for those of you that are familiar with cellular bands, the 600 to 800 is the low band of cellular, which is what you would want to use in a rural environment. So it's exactly the wrong place to have the coexistence really work, and especially with a 24/7. But that's one of the constraints that has to be dealt with in coming up with a solution. The courses of action that we identified, similar to now what I shared with you in the early slides, but now in a little different order. The fixed broadband, the need for broadband into the home, and that is sorely lacking. There are many places that have virtually no broadband into their home at all. But there is BEAD and things that are related to BEAD, the U.S. government $42.5 billion initiative to provide broadband to all homes and to all businesses and all occupied areas. And so the broadband service locations, the BSLs, are being covered. It's been a long time. BEAD has been around for 5 years from the approval in Congress, but both in determining what needed to be covered and having it covered commercially, and to some degree, BEAD itself now coming in is covering the broadband needs. So we've discovered that, sorted it out, talked to the West Virginia Broadband Authority, and determined that problem, if not resolved, was at least not where we should place our focus. The focus, therefore, came to the second one, mobile broadband, and not just for individuals, but for industry and for public safety. We determined that should be our focus, and therefore established a methodology for simulating the environment and trying to determine how to improve the environment based on the simulations that we put in place. And again, you see on the right many pictures of the area, but those hexagons around the key facilities are the important ones for us to make sure that we protect. We did do assessments using unconstrained characteristics. We did later talk to the cell phone providers, and they gave us a lot of additional information. But for a first pass at this, we attempted to place terrestrial cell towers in places that would optimize the coverage for the area, and you'll see the results of that as we go. We did analyze the direct-to-cell satellite capability and how that would and could be helpful, and the modernization versus the threat that I've already touched on. We estimated costs and found once we compared those costs with what the cellular providers said, we discovered our costs were low. It's costs a very large amount of money to get power and to build roads, even to place where you would want to put the tower for optimal configuration. And so we modified our costs as we move forward based on that input. So the conclusion that we came to is that there is significant opportunity for improvement, and you're going to see that as we go. And for emergency services, there is improvement for the land mobile radio, the traditional push-to-talk radio that can be had. Another group worked on that problem specifically for these two counties, and there is some work going forward to improve the situation for land mobile radios. But that's not the only needs. The needs are for use of smart devices for the emergency services as well. Talk about that. First, the mobile transmission, the problem that you would understand from a satellite standpoint, it's good to be able to hit the proverbial, not really proverbial, but the Starlink broadband capability that's illustrated on the left, but increasingly the ability to cover smartphones as well without the red impacting the federal facilities. So that impact comes from the satellite itself, but on the right-hand side, it can also come from the devices that are held terrestrially. So challenge is to enable this, but not to impact the facility, and we did some looking at that. Satellite communications overall, for broadband, we determined that the current broadband, aside from the challenges of placing the antenna, that not only was workable, but could solve a lot of the problems that weren't covered by BEAD and other terrestrial means. So we determined that broadband was really not the major problem, fixed broadband, I should say, and that satellite could be a significant part of the solution. The challenge is looking at the direct-to-cell, and we determined that from our perspective, things may change over time, but that does not look like it is much of a solution in the National Radio Quiet Zone. The challenge there is the terrain itself, the foliage. When you're driving on the roads, most roads are tree covered. The devices themselves, as many of you would know, are relatively low power. Cell phones are made to just barely work so that you can reuse the spectrum. And that's great terrestrial. It's not great when you're trying to reach a satellite high in the sky. So for the near term, we don't think that the satellite solution is very helpful. It can be, as a last resort, helpful in emergency situations where you go try to find an open field where you can connect to a satellite. So it's not that it shouldn't be used at all, but it's not really a very workable solution. And in any case, the capabilities at satellite, at least currently, are relatively low capabilities as well. So turning to terrestrial, this is the three major carriers, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. As of a little over a year ago, this was their coverage. The deep purple is 5G. Surprise, surprise, T-Mobile is focused on 5G. The others, Verizon in particular, is mostly 4G. AT&T is a mix. But I'm not sure that you can really see my pointer, but about midway down and a little to the left of center is the location of the Green Bank Observatory. And as you can see on all three, there's no coverage anywhere close to that, which is by design, and that's a good thing. But given how many people that live in the areas that are not, that are of the either pale green or cream color. That's a lot of area that's not very well covered. So the challenge is to improve that situation. I would hasten to add that we discovered that these charts are very generous in terms of what coverage means. Coverage basically means 1 bar or more. So the fact that it is colored as being covered does not necessarily mean that you can talk to someone, but they, or at least in any consistent way. But you do have the general feel coming out of this. So our work was to try to see what we could do to improve that. And we, using what I've already described, we placed, in a simulation fashion, we placed cells. The blue cells were full cells with 3 sectors. The pink or salmon colored cells had only 2 sectors in most cases, and the sector that would have pointed towards the Greenbank Observatory were removed. And using that capability, we then placed handsets, the orange dots, and then looked at the impact from either the base station or from the handsets, and that simulation is what you will see in the coming slides here. So, using that and optimizing the placement and ensuring at the same time that we weren't impacting the facilities, we found that we were able, at least hypothetically, able to add dramatically to the coverage area for the National Radio Quiet Zone. In fact, we could add 810 square miles out of the 13,000 square miles that are encompassed by the National Radio Quiet Zone, which is a considerable addition because we do have the coverage that you saw in the outlying areas. So this is coverage in areas that were not there before. The cost, and this is where it's a broad range, and this was our interactions with the carriers, from $300,000 to $1.5 million per site, with an OPEX of under $40,000 per year. So this would really enhance the lives of the people in the zone from a communications standpoint. We did learn a lot from our engagement with the service providers, and they have thought about this quite a lot. It was not uniform, and I won't name names, but some of the carriers were more focused in this area than others. And their challenge is not so much knowing what to do. They know that they can dramatically improve coverage, but their challenge is economic. In order to provide the coverage, there are not enough people to, when you look at the $1.5 million for a site, if there are 3 houses that provides coverage for, it's not an economical thing for them to do. This shows the handset side of things. We placed handsets on roadways, and these are take a little bit of study, and we'll make these slides available for those that are interested. But what these slides show, this is the number, we placed them in 300 locations, and then how many of the 300 locations would potentially have impact to the Greenbank Observatory. And the right is 300, and so just the placement of the lines that intersect the x-axis is just below the 300, and then you get out here, and so this is 10, So it's in all cases less than 10 locations out of the 300 where you would have any impact to the Green Bank Observatory at all. So we felt pretty good about where we had put our placements, and this can be optimized so that there are zero. In fact, since we know where they are, we can make sure that those are not impacting the site. So recommendations, again, somewhat repeating what I gave you at the front end: prioritize the terrestrial broadband modernization, take advantage of the simulation, working with the mobile service providers since they have much better tools than what we had to place things. And the key is to find economic ways to encourage or incent them to provide that coverage. There's a lot of work with the NRAO group, and if money allowed, we could contribute considerably to this as well because of the work we've done. But this would enhance the lives of people, both in their personal lives, but also provide considerable support for emergency services. Leveraging BEAD is key, and the broadband to the home, broadband to the business that it provides is great. Continue the work with the satellites. The broadband, particularly more distant from the Green Bank Observatory. There's no reason not to use satellites for broadband to the home as a part of the BEAD program, among other things, but also to use it, at least make it available to assist with emergency services need initiation activities. There is a need for a framework, which we helped to develop, but further development is needed in that area to fully understand the environment and the interference, how to mitigate it, how to avoid it, where the hills are that can block it, and all the rest. And then the framework is a key part as well. Making sure that things like drones and autonomous vehicles don't become a problem, and finding ways to, if anything, improve the interference environment around, particularly the Green Bank telescope, to enable it to do its job of exploring and understanding the universe. And with that, you now know all about our activities, and for those that didn't know about the National Radio Quiet Zone, you have some feeling for what that zone is all about. And now I will look forward to your questions.